So I'm Ken Lusbader, and I'm going to be sort of hosting tonight's event. I'm one of the co-directors of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. I just saw the name of, I believe, Dr. Charles Ellenfeld, which is wonderful to have here. Dr. Ellenfeld is probably the last direct connection to Dr. Harry Benjamin, because he worked with him as a student and has a close association with him. So that's exciting to have a direct connection with someone so close to Harry Benjamin. Again, if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be answering that at the end. If there are questions during the presentation, please let us know. It's 6:31, so we're going to give people still more time to come into the presentation from the waiting room. It's wonderful to see so many people here. It's wonderful to see people who I know. Hey, Sid, how you doing? I see Jeff Iavone, who has helped and worked with the project as a consultant doing research. The run of the show is going to be, I'm going to start about 6:35. We're going to hear me talk a brief bit about our project, give you some examples of sites associated with Harry Benjamin, and then introduce Susan Stryker, who will speak about sort of trans medical care, the history of it, and contextualize Dr. Harry Benjamin, and then Alison, who will talk about her recent biography on Harry Benjamin, which is here. And you know, the history of Harry Benjamin's involvement in trans medical care, Alison will go into the details, but her book really addresses the history of hormone therapy, the discovery of hormones, endocrinology. So it's a broader picture of transformation, which is a really wonderful sort of way to understand early 20th century medicine and healthcare. I am no way an expert, so this is a great opportunity to hear from experts. We are place-based historians, so we are trying to amass this information to present to the public. So it's still 6:33. We're going to wait till 6:35. Thanks for coming. We have about 37 people in the room already, and more people are coming in from the waiting room.
If anyone would like to share where you're watching from, it's always fun to see if we have people from New York or outside the city. Brooklyn's first up. Queens, Seattle, Chicago, Astoria, Scarsdale, Buffalo, Bloomington, Indiana. Oh, this is great. The Bronx. San Francisco, LA, Glendale, Queens, Bushwick, Brooklyn, DC. Wow, Denver.
Thanks for the shout out, Deborah Fisher. Thank you. I just put in the chat the University of North Carolina Press.org with the discount code. There's a 30% discount if you're interested in purchasing the book. And it's
great geographical representation in our audience, which is fun.
We started this project officially launching in 2015 with a grant from the National Park Service Underrepresented Communities Program to increase diversity on the National Register. At the time of our application, there were 2 sites officially listed associated with LGBTQ history. And today, I believe there are, and Amanda, you can correct me, I think 29. We are working on, and I'll go into this in a little more detail, one amendment now and overlay of the Greenwich Village Historic District that's almost complete. But it's a way for us to memorialize LGBTQ history by the federal government, which is the National Register is the list and registration list of historic sites associated with American history, culture, and we are happy to be represented now. Just bear with me as I'm just multitasking here. So it's in I'm going to begin the presentation now in keeping with our protocol that people, it's 6:37, we want to run on time, and I'm going to just clean up my screen here. For those who have not dealt with Zoom, there's a little bit of chaos for me in this mode here. So I'm now going to shift to the official presentation. So we've got about 45 people here. There may be still some coming into the room. And as we said, if you want to show your face, we're more than happy to see you. If not, we understand, but feel free to participate in the chat, and we'll take it from there. I want to thank our funders, Consolidated Edison, New York Community Trust, and the New York Tourism Foundation for helping support this program for tonight. And I want to thank our speakers, Alison Li and Susan Stryker. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues at the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, Jay Shockley, Andrew Dolcart, and Amanda Davis, who's our project manager. Before we begin, I want to give you a brief overview. The NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project is a cultural heritage initiative and educational resource. We were launched in 2015 by historic preservationists who document an untold history of New York City through a queer lens, using the built environment to do so. And our website is a very visible and accessible way to do that. We have 450 sites, more than 450 sites thus far documented, associated with the resource types you could see on the right. And we have each one of these sites associated with multiple significance or individual significance. So you can explore this cultural landscape that we've created. And we look at sites that are not just self-referential, the obvious Stonewall that talks about LGBTQ history directly and activism, but through a lens of the community's influence on American culture. So that could be a site of performance venue where someone wrote a work of literature, a work of architecture, and so forth. If our map is a little overwhelming because it's grown so much, you can explore by theme. We have about 36 themes right now, including one on transgender history, the Harlem Renaissance. This is just a smattering of them. You could click on one of our themes and then go explore sites associated with that as well. We also, as I mentioned earlier, are getting sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We work closely with our colleagues at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation to document these sites. As I mentioned, these are the sites that meet the requirements to have national significance, specifically associated with LGBTQ history. This was starting in 1999 with Stonewall. Our two colleagues, Jay Shockley and Andrew Dolcart, wrote that nomination, but since then, through the funding of the National Park Service, we've done countless others, or I should say not countless. I'd like to say we've done many others, including more recently the Lillian Wald residence, and we're working on one for the Jaffe Theater to incorporate its LGBTQ past. And as I mentioned, we're doing an overlay of the Greenwich Village Historic District to include all of its LGBTQ associations. We also advocate for local designations and do, as this example shows, walking tours, public programs such as this, trolley rides, get plaques put on buildings, and so forth. So we're a full-stop shop for LGBTQ site-based history. Again, the evening here is really talking about transmedical care through the sort of focus on Dr. Harry Benjamin. I first came across Dr. Benjamin's name when researching Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist who was so instrumental in late 19th, early 20th century. And I was trying to find a site for him in New York City, came across this article in the New York Times that said Harry Benjamin worked with him. And it was perplexing to me because I saw this very avuncular looking man and couldn't figure out why was this German immigrant working here and who was he? So down the road, I had looked at all these other associations that are on this Venn diagram, and we've documented a number of them, beginning with Harry Benjamin and his office on the Upper East Side, which you may hear about a bit later through the experts, Alison and Susan. to Magnus Hirschfeld's, where he stayed on his tour in 1930 at the Hotel New Yorker. We've associated Harry Benjamin with Charlotte Charlock, who was one of the first three people to undergo gender affirmation surgery in Germany from 1928 to the early 1930s. She was deported and wound up living in New York City and in Brooklyn, where she passed away in the Hotel Pierpont in 1963. And we've documented her site there. Christine Jorgensen, who many of you may have known the name, she came back from Denmark in 1953, was swarmed in Idlewood, now JFK Airport, and went to her childhood residence with the support of her parents to kind of be sequestered there. We have that site. And Dr. Renee Richards in the screenshot there, speaking at the memorial for Dr. Harry Benjamin in 1987. We have her associated with the West Side Tennis Club and her activism there. Reed Erickson, who was a trans man who was very instrumental in funding Dr. Benjamin's practice and office space. He was also instrumental in creating the One Archives at the USC libraries. And the latest one we just added is the residence of Dr. Jean Hoff and her office. Dr. Hoff was reportedly the first trans psychiatrist to work with trans patients beginning in 1978 in this Chelsea building. It's where a documentary featuring her was shot called Becoming Jean, that was broadcast by WNBC in 1978. We have more contemporary sites associated with trans history. Transy House, which was a row house in Park Slope in the 1990s, early 2000s, for trans and gender nonconforming people to live as a refuge. There's an image on the right with Sylvia Rivera in the back there. That was her last place of residency. And then Marsha P. Johnson State Park in Brooklyn, the newly sort of announced park in honor of the activist Marsha P. Johnson, pictured on the right. So you could learn more about our work at the website, or you can follow us on social media. And I encourage you to do so because we have a lot of this content. I'm going to introduce Susan now, and then Alison. Susan will speak, and then we're going to pivot to Alison. But Susan Stryker's historical research, theoretical writings, media making, activism, and academic field building practice activities have helped shape the conversation of trans issues since the early 1990s. And I'm thrilled that Susan is here today to giving us her time and complementing Alison's biography. Alison Li is a historian of science and medicine based in Toronto. She earned a PhD in the history and philosophy of science and technology from the University of Toronto. She recently published the book that we're talking about today, The Wondrous Transformations, A Maverick Physician, The Science of Hormones, and the Birth of the Transgender Revolution. Her work focuses on the history of hormone science and the culture in which it was shaped. And as I mentioned, we can put this in the chat again. If you're interested in purchasing the book at a discount, you could do that. And I think that is it. I'm going to let Susan take it from here. But thank you, and I look forward to an exciting presentation.
Thank you, Ken. Can everybody hear me just fine? Get a thumbs up here. Great. Okay, so yeah, Ken, we have been in touch about many things over many years. I'm glad we finally had a chance to do something together. So thanks for here. And thanks to the back of the house people, Christina and Amanda, Dr. Eilenfeld. What an honor to learn that you are in the audience. I've seen your name on many documents and author of many articles over many, many years. So it's really nice to have that personal presence from you. I hope maybe there'll be some time for you to offer some comments from the floor, so to speak. And as I say in my blurb on the back cover of the book, it's like, Alison, what an amazing job you have done with telling the world Harry Benjamin's story. He is such an important figure in the history of the medicalization of trans issues. Was interested to hear Ken just say you learned about Benjamin through through doing research on Magnus Hirschfeld. And I learned about Harry Benjamin as a very young trans thing back in the 1970s, looking for information about people such as myself. And there was an organization called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which was the main service providers organization. It's now known as WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. But it was named after Harry Benjamin in honor of his path-breaking contributions to the field of trans medicine. So he's somebody that I've known about for going on, more than 40 years at this point. As a professional historian, I've had a chance to do some of my own research into his life. I used to be on faculty at Indiana University in Bloomington, and had a chance to take some deep dives into the Kinsey Institute, which is where Benjamin's papers are housed. And I will just say, Alison, it's just like there are things that I saw about Benjamin's personality that you really capture in your biography of him. Like that he loved road trips and going to see movies by himself and was an avid photographer. I've interviewed people who were his patients, who say oh, he was a delightful little gentleman, or he had an impish sense of humor, that all of these details about the man have come out in your work, as well as the really remarkable contextualization that you do of his career and of his place in different medical fields, and in the broader social and cultural history of medicine. So anyway, kudos. Everybody buy that book. Use that coupon to get a cheap copy. One thing I do want to point out, however, as a trans person, is that this is a book, as the subtitle points out, about a medical doctor and the science of hormones. And I just think it's so important to say that there's a great deal about trans history and trans lives that lie beyond the medicalization of our lives. It's like trans people are not defined by trans medicine. And that it's not the doctors, it's not the scientists, it's not the lawyers, it's not the politicians, it's not the religious leader who define what counts as a trans life. It's we who are trans people who hold that ability to name ourselves, and that we are the ones who give birth to a transgender revolution, and we welcome the involvement of everybody who is committed to that practice of liberation. It is really hard, I think, to compare earlier periods with the present and more recent past, just because there's such different conceptual vocabularies, different practices of self. But certainly, well before what we think of as trans medicine today, there were people in the 17th, 16th centuries, far back in history, who persistently lived their lives as best they could in a gender other than the one that they were assigned to at birth by whatever means were available to them, whether that was changing their names or changing the pronouns or changing the way they dress or changing what they did for a living. There were people who transgender as it was given to them. And I also feel like it's important to point out that those gender transition has not always been like a one-way, one-time transition. There have been plenty of people who have crossed back and forth over the way gender has been organized socially, often more than once. One of my favorite or most poignant stories I know from U.S. what I think of as trans history. There was an indentured servant back in the Virginia colonies in the 1620s who went by the name both Thomasine and Thomas Hall. And they were indentured as a man. They came to work in the tobacco fields. As soon as they got here, they started dressing as a woman. It caused this consternation. They were eventually determined to be female, and then they were ordered to dress as a woman, and then they was like, oh no, they're intersex, they have to dress as a man. They go back and forth, several times over the course of their time in Virginia. And if you dig into the history for yourself, I just think it's a fascinating account of how gender is not nearly as fixed as we think it is, that it's been fluid for a lot of people for a very long time. But by the 19th century, certainly, it is really easy to see people living lives that seem very similar to trans lives today. A large part of that similarity has to do with the things that they had to contend with in society. They had to try to, I think of it as finding agency within a medical, psychological, legal set of institutions and practices that are really not that different from today. We often think about trans medicine, for those of us who are more privileged, as something that we do to express our agency, as something that we do to become who we think we are. It's life enhancing. It increases the scope and ability of our lives somehow. But I also think it's important to point out how a lot of the practices that we think of as trans medicine have been really closely tied to psychiatric incarceration, the penal system, denial of rights, as well as ability to live life in a new way. A couple of people I think of in trans history along these lines: Mary Jones. Ken, if you haven't done any work on her yet, she was an early 19th century trans sex working person in the Bowery who was accused of pickpocketing, winds up in Sing Sing. There's a lot of amazing documentation of her life. In the 1840s, nationwide, there were apparently enough people who were crossing the social boundaries of gender that they decided to criminalize it. In the 1840s through the 1860s and 70s, there's dozens of U.S. cities that, for the first time in U.S. history, at the municipal level, write codes that criminalize cross-dressing, which previously that had not been codified. Another person to mention briefly would be Joseph Israel Lobdell, who also published under the name Lucy Ann Lobdell, wrote this amazing book in upstate New York called The Female Hunter of Delaware and Sullivan Counties. It was one of the first feminist anti-marriage tracts. It's like Lucy Ann was somebody who'd been abandoned with a small child by their husband. They write this book, and like, marriage sucks. It makes women second-class citizens. We can't get jobs. And they decide to go out in the woods and hunt for a living and to live as a man. And they live as a man for the rest of their lives, even after they had opportunities to do other things. They married a woman. They changed their name to Joseph Israel Lobdell rather than Lucy Ann. And quite ironically, they wound up being psychiatrically incarcerated later in life at the Willard Institute for the Chronic Insane in Ovid, New York. One of the first psychiatric hospitals, psychiatric lockup wards in the U.S. And that, it really seems that they were locked up because their family didn't like the fact that they were trans. They thought there was a chance that they could take Lobdell's property by having her, in their words, locked up. And they told Lobdell's wife that he had died. He hadn't, and he spent, decades in psychiatric lockup. I could go on and on, but I won't. We're running out of time. We need to talk to Alison. I just want to say that by the time Harry Benjamin comes along in the early 20th centuries, that he is part of a fully formed, I would call it, discourse on being trans. It's like that this idea that you can use surgery and hormones to enact legal name change and change in gender markers, and that people who say, like, I feel like I'm an X and I should be a Y. It's like that that there was by the early 19th century, like or by the early 20th century, more than a century ago, a really well articulated set of medical and legal practices for doing that. Benjamin was right at the center of it. His specialty in hormones was a really important part of the scientific changes that produce modern ideas of transness. And with that, I think I should shut up and we get to the main event, which is Alison talking about her amazing new biography.
Thank you so much for those wonderful remarks and those very important cautions. I just wanted to start with a little scene. First of all, in January 1975, Tom Buckley, who was a reporter for the New York Times, arrived at the modest apartment on East 31st Street. It was the home of Harry Benjamin. The reporter found Benjamin gentle and avuncular, and at the age of 90, still moderately active and reasonably healthy. Buckley quipped that Benjamin must have been one of the last New Yorkers to receive visitors dressed in a silk smoking jacket. But any reader assuming old-fashioned attitudes to go with the old world manner would have been sorely mistaken. As it happened, Harry Benjamin regularly confounded expectations. Renee Richards met him in 1964 and had the impression of him as a regular old fuss budget, a typical old world practitioner. And Jan Morris thought that with his strong German accent, he sounded like a Viennese psychiatrist from the movies, and that he looked like a white gnome who was white-haired, white-jacketed, white-faced, and too small for his desk. And they were both soon to learn that there was much more to Benjamin than first met the eye. Buckley's article bore the headline, "Transsexuality Expert, 90, Recalls Maverick Career." And it described Benjamin's remarkable life, his reputation as a medical maverick, and his care of people whose internal sense of gender was at odds with the sex they were assigned at birth. And it's my privilege tonight to share with you some of Harry Benjamin's story. So I wanted to say good evening to you from Toronto. New York formed such a key part of Harry Benjamin's story, and I'm so happy to visit you, again, if only on Zoom. And I'd really like to thank Ken Lusbaden and the curators at the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you. And tonight, it's a special privilege for me to be in conversation with Susan Stryker, whose scholarship is so foundational to this field. And I thank you for your opening comments and the very important cautions that you framed this discussion with. What I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to share with you how I came to write a biography of Harry Benjamin and why I think his story is worth telling. And I'd like to just say a few words about terminology, because of course the language used in talking about trans people is evolving rapidly, and so that some of the terms that were used a few years ago are considered inappropriate today, and terms of the past, like transvestite and transsexual, are no longer commonly used, but I try to use them carefully when it's required because they describe historical concepts and categories that don't always map exactly onto the terms that we use today. So here's Harry Benjamin's story in brief. He was born in Berlin in 1885 and trained as a doctor in Germany. And in 1913, he came to the United States and became stranded here with the outbreak of the First World War. He ended up building a private practice in New York City and a summer practice in San Francisco, and around 1949 began to treat transgender patients. In 1966, he published the groundbreaking book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which was one of the first major texts to describe transgender identity in clinical terms and to argue for compassionate treatment. Benjamin's work went on to influence a generation of trans people and the professionals who work with them. What this brief outline hides are the elements that made writing this biography quite challenging. First, there was the sheer longevity of the man. He lived to 101 and didn't retire until he was 90. So this was a man who grew up catching sight of Otto von Bismarck on the streets of Imperial Berlin and lived to see miniskirts and bell-bottoms and the Beatles. He was friend to Magnus Hirschfeld, the doctor who in 1910 coined the term transvestite, and he lived to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show become a cult phenomenon. The other important challenge was the fact that although Benjamin is now known for his work in transgender medicine, he actually spent an entire career working in a completely different field, geriatric medicine. So the question I really had to answer was, how did he come to be a physician and advocate for trans people? To answer this, I'd like to share a few key episodes from his life. Benjamin was born in a Berlin that is known for its militarism and efficiency. And this is the earliest picture we have of him at the age of 24 with his mother, Bertha. He's dressed in the uniform of the Prussian Guard because he was doing his compulsory military service. And what's important to understand is that though the Berlin is known that he was born in was known for militarism and efficiency, it was also the home to great scientific and technological progress and political and cultural ferment. And as a young medical student, Benjamin became acquainted with Magnus Hirschfeld, who Ken has mentioned earlier. Hirschfeld was a physician and activist for homosexual rights, and in 1891, he and his associates formed the first organization in the world to champion the rights of gay people. Hirschfeld conducted tours of Berlin's gay bars for visiting academics and police officials with the goal of showing them that homosexuals were not a threat to society. And as a student, Benjamin was taken along for these tours, including visits to the famous club El Dorado, where trans people gathered. Hirschfeld was one of the first to recognize that individuals who cross-dressed were not necessarily the same as those who had same-sex desires, because, and this was important because until then, they were grouped together. He was the person who created the term transvestite in 1910, and Hirschfeld would become a key influence on Benjamin. Although Benjamin is best known now as the father of transsexualism, that's one of the terms by which he's known, I actually became interested in him for quite another reason, which was his connection with glandular rejuvenation. There was a very colorful period in the 1920s when all sorts of glandular cures were being touted. There was optimism that hormones might hold the secret to fundamental questions like the meaning of personality and behavior, growth and aging, and certainly the nature of sex. And perhaps the thought was that learning about glands would offer doctors ways of manipulating these characteristics, perhaps even change human destiny. And in the 1920s, Benjamin became a devout disciple of the respected Viennese psychologist Eugen Steinach and a champion of the Steinach operation, which was an operation that was intended to slow the aging process. This treatment was viewed with suspicion by the medical establishment even at the time, and would later be disproved in subsequent decades. But in 1922, Benjamin gained fame because he treated the popular author Gertrude Atherton. Atherton felt so restored by her treatment that she ended up writing a best-selling novel about rejuvenation. The novel Black Oxen topped the bestseller list in 1923 and inspired a hit film the following year. And the publicity they generated brought a great deal of attention to Benjamin's practice. You can see here is a young Harry Benjamin here in this little inset. 1922 was a landmark year in hormone science for other reasons, because it marked the discovery of insulin. Insulin, as you will know, has gone on to save the lives of hundreds of millions of people with diabetes around the globe. And its discovery caused a sea change in endocrinology. Many new researchers came to learn about the field and try to find other hormones of medical value. And pharmaceutical companies poured resources in trying to develop these products. Through the next decades, Harry Benjamin built a thriving practice on Park Avenue, treating movie stars, opera singers, and millionaire businessmen. He had a 12-room suite of offices, and dominating the waiting room was a life mass of Goethe, the great poet. As more commercial products became available, Benjamin also added hormone injections and pills alongside the use of the Steinach procedure. Benjamin always retained an interest in sexology and was usually on the side of greater sexual liberty. he was an early advocate for sex workers. And during the Weimar era, he made regular visits to Berlin, where Magnus Hirschfeld had established the Institute for Sexual Science, which was the first in the world devoted to the scientific study of sex. The Institute had dozens of staff, and it provided medical services, publications, and lectures, and it housed a very popular museum that drew visitors from around the world. And it was here that trans people were able to find acceptance and employment. One of the earliest people known to have had surgery for gender transition was Dora Richter, a housekeeper at the Institute. She had procedures performed in 1922 and 1931. Lily Elba, who you may know as the subject of the movie The Danish Girl, was also treated at the Institute in 1930. Harry Benjamin and his wife hosted Hirschfeld when he visited New York in 1930 on the first leg of his world tour. And as Ken mentioned, there's a depiction of this on the website. But the important work of the Institute came to an abrupt end in May 1933, when it was sacked by students who were backed by the Nazi Party. Its library was thrown to the flames in the first of the infamous book burnings, and Hirschfeld died in exile 2 years later, and it seemed that his work died with him. But in 1949, when Benjamin was 64 years old, and just as he was beginning to think of retiring, he received a request from his colleague, Alfred Kinsey, the sexologist. Kinsey asked him to see a patient whom Kinsey found puzzling. This patient, who we know by the pseudonym Val Berry, had been assigned male at birth, but had from childhood lived as a girl. Working with her would turn Benjamin's career in a whole new direction. Most doctors of the time assumed trans people had a psychiatric problem and that it was a doctor's job to change their minds to match their bodies. Benjamin was willing to consider that it might be wiser and more humane to treat Berry's body to match her mind. Instead of retiring, he would then go on to spend the next few decades becoming a physician and leading advocate for transgender people, and he would do so in the face of fierce criticism and disapproval. Thanks to his connection with Steinach and Hirschfeld, Benjamin was able to think of the body as malleable and sex as not fixed. And thanks to his years of giving hormone therapy to his aging patients, he felt comfortable supplying the means to begin Val Berry's transition. Benjamin's colleagues Leah Schaefer and Christine Wheeler put it this way: Benjamin's work in the field was an accident for which he was totally prepared. Benjamin's practice with transgender people grew by word of mouth. He had long been an outsider in medical circles already, so he wasn't really put off by censure. And what's more, he now had the wisdom and courage of age. He connected with trans networks and trans pioneers such as Christine Jorgensen, who had become famous in 1953 after her gender transition in Denmark. And Louise Lawrence, an important transgender community organizer. They became valued collaborators. Together, they bandied about ideas to try to get at the heart of this condition that they were trying to define. Benjamin's approach was cautious, not knowing the long-term implications for the health and well-being of his patients. He urged them to proceed slowly and only change the body as a last resort. And when they underwent treatment, he often found it difficult to do proper follow-ups of his patients because they often preferred to quietly disappear into their new lives. But over time, as he began to document successful cases, he became more confident that this approach was correct. He not only provided hormone therapy, but helped his patients in practical ways, such as getting identification papers and finding a surgeon. And by the 1960s, as historian Joanne Meyerowitz puts it, for anyone who is interested in transsexualism, most roads led to Benjamin. He was really at the center of many networks. He and a small group of colleagues began to gather data, and much of what they were able to accomplish was thanks to the funding of a wealthy trans businessman, Reed Erickson, who founded the Erickson Educational Foundation. which Ken also spoke about. This foundation was really critical to their work. Erickson was aware that he was privileged because of his money and that most trans people had difficulty getting the information and the treatment they wanted. And his foundation supported research in many areas to help human flourishing. But the most significant area it supported was transsexualism. And it did that through funding research, public lectures, films, television and radio appearances, pamphlets, and a referral list of service providers. So at the age of 81, Benjamin felt prepared to publish the groundbreaking book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. As he explained, I felt that after 50 years in the practice of medicine and in the evening of life, I need not be too concerned with a disapproval that touches much more on morals than on science. The book was written in an accessible style that made it a bit valuable not only to health professionals, but to many trans people and their families as well. While Benjamin's name was associated with medically assisted transition, it's also important to recognize that he collaborated and worked with people who self-identified as transvestite, who wanted nothing from the medical profession. And in these cases, he suggested, instead of treating the patient, it would be frequently wiser and more constructive to treat society educationally, so that logic, understanding, and compassion might prevail. Benjamin's patients, whether aging or transgender, always remarked on his calm and compassionate manner. In particular, many trans people had experienced fear and disdain and disbelief at the hands of their doctors, so being looked in the eye and treated with respect by a person in a white coat was a revelation. One colleague observed how Benjamin gave each patient his full attention and was concerned for them as if they were family. Benjamin came to epitomize for him the ideal doctor-patient relationship, one that was characterized by closeness and caring. Benjamin consulted in the establishment of university-based gender clinics, the first of which was at Johns Hopkins, and which was shortly followed by other universities. By the time Benjamin retired at the age of 90, he had become physician to over 1,000 trans people, and the Association of Healthcare Professionals in Trans Medicine was founded in 1979 and named in his honor. It's now known as WPATH. Benjamin might strike people of today as patronizing and old-fashioned. After all, the man who referred to his female trans patients as HG, or his girls, was in many ways a product of his era and its gender norms. In deciding who made a good candidate for surgical transition, he and his associates were preoccupied with whether a trans person would pass in their desired gender. They were very concerned that trans patients who regretted an outcome might seek revenge on their doctors. More importantly, his cautious approach to determining eligibility, an approach that became codified in the earliest standards of care, had embedded in it assumptions of heteronormativity, a gender binary, and the belief that psychological distress is an inherent characteristic of being transgender. And of course, these assumptions have been increasingly challenged. Benjamin lived to 101, surrounded by a small circle of friends and colleagues. And Dr. Charles Eilenfeld, who we're very honored to have with us today, was a stalwart friend and support to Benjamin and his wife Gretchen in their final days. So finally, why do I think Harry Benjamin's story is worth telling? Well, over the past years, when people asked me what I was working on, I would tell them it was the story of a doctor who worked with trans people beginning in the 1950s, and often they were very surprised. Many of them had assumed that trans issues are a very recent phenomenon, but of course they aren't. Scholars in trans studies, as Susan has described to us, have been helping us understand that trans people have made lives for themselves in many cultures and many periods through history, long before the advent of this sort of medicine. But we have also learned that medical and scientific attempts to understand trans identity and the use of medicine to help trans people have a history that stretches back over a century. So the study of history gives us a richer perspective to interpret the events of today and the tools to resist disinformation. And that's why projects like NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project are so vital. Telling Benjamin's story is worthwhile, if only to say that trans people and trans medicine are nothing new. I think Benjamin's story also has something to teach us about the development of science and medicine. Historians who've written about Benjamin have focused either on his transgender medicine work or to a lesser extent on his work in rejuvenation. But I found that by tackling his entire life and wrestling with the question of how these parts fit together, we gain a better picture of how medical ideas and practices actually develop, which is often messy, convoluted, and full of chance events and dead ends. But finally, I think Benjamin's story is worth telling from a human angle. In our iconoclastic age, it's really a mistake to try to set anyone on a pedestal. And like on any of us, of course, Benjamin was flawed. And critiques of his approach are important and valid. But in my years spent studying him, I also found much to admire. I learned about a man who was willing to learn and grow, and who, through deep listening to his trans patients and trans colleagues, came to see people in a new way. Whatever the shortcomings of his theories and methods, his humane approach did an immense amount of good. In facing the condemnation of his peers and defying the conventions of his time, in treating his patients with compassion and respect, Benjamin eased the suffering of many people and helped open an important new field of care. At his memorial, trans pioneer Renee Richards acted as a spokesperson for all of Benjamin's patients, saying, "We are grateful to him because without him, I don't know what our fate may have been. A fragmented personality, a suicide, many possible things other than the integrated, consolidated, productive people that many of us are." I hope that this book can make a contribution by sharing Benjamin's story with a wider audience and by showing how one person was willing to learn, change his mind, and make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I don't know why I get so moved by hearing about his contributions in his life, but the impact that he had on many people. And just that quote, I watched, there's a brief video, it's not so brief, of the memorial to Harry Benjamin in 1987, and I watched the entire thing, and it was just so moving to hear people talking about him with all, reading your book, seeing his sort of a stubborn streak, a private streak, he was an outlier, but it's very moving to see that impact. One of the things when we talked about the book and your presentation was, he primarily treated, white privileged people who had access to that medical care. And when I was doing some research, it was interesting to note that, he was in New York, but no one like Holly Woodlawn or Candy Darling, those people associated with even Warhol, were going to him, or I don't know that if they did, but people of color, where were they going? And was he aware of that, even of what the issues were outside of that microcosm of people that were within that particular network? And for people in the audience, there were newsletters, magazines, there was a network of communication for trans people or gender nonconforming, or what terminology we would overlay today, during that period for connections. But where were those people that didn't have access to that? And was that something that was integrated in your research?
That's such a great question, Ken. I think coming up with those answers can be really challenging, because partly because then the records are very hard to find if they are not people who found their way to Harry Benjamin. What I did find was actually a surprising number of people really went to great efforts to actually make their way to New York or San Francisco just to meet with him, and went to great expense and dealt with a great hardships to be able to meet him. So it's really quite moving to read these stories of people who really try to make their way to him. But obviously, I think you're right that there were lots of people who were left out of the story as well.
No, it's, we're documenting or working to document sites in New York associated with underrepresented communities within the LGBTQ umbrella. And it's challenging because the record, to find the written record is one of our hurdles. There's a question in the chat about, can you talk a little about his time in San Francisco? I mean, reading the book and just looking at the Kinsey Institute and other online archives, he really had a rich life in San Francisco.
Yeah. He absolutely loved San Francisco, and in fact, he of course loved to escape the heat of the New York summers, and he also spent some time in LA because he loved hobnobbing with the Hollywood crowd as well. But thanks to his connection with Gertrude Atherton, who was a famous San Francisco author, she introduced him to some of the most important players, and he became quite popular with many socialites in San Francisco. He really enjoyed being there, and but he also enjoyed what he thought was sort of the Barbary Coast kind of flavor of San Francisco. And one of the things that I learned was that he really was interested in working with several of the people in the brothels. He became a doctor to the sex workers in several of the brothels in San Francisco. So he really fit into the community in many different ways.
Susan has her hand up. Could you unmute yourself, or could we unmute Susan?
Yeah, well, I raised my hand to say, Harry Benjamin, used to, be the sexually transmitted disease doctor for a lot of the higher end brothels, but Alison beat me to the punch. So the other thing I would say about Benjamin's time in San Francisco is that he did work with clients from a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds. I interviewed some people who had been his patients, some of whom were quoted in a film I made called Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. And, one of them just says like, oh, Harry Benjamin, he gave hormones to everybody. I interviewed Alicia Brevard, who transitioned in 1962 or 3. And she said that, she had been getting her hormones from, some black market provider, and a friend of hers is like, oh no, you got to go to Harry Benjamin. It's like he will fix you up. So he had he had to pay, but he also had a very egalitarian practice. He didn't turn people away.
There's a question from Sid here. I'm going to just read it in its entirety so you have it all. Thinking of Lou Sullivan's activism and his memoirs that Dr. Stryker edited, can you talk about Benjamin's strict ideas about the idea that trans people had to be heterosexual in their identities? How could he accept that gay people could exist but stop thinking that trans people couldn't be gay? And this is sort of, Alison and I talked about this on a prior call about this binary kind of idea.
Susan, would you like to take that question?
I would say there was definitely a difference between the front of the house and the back of the house. That officially they would say have to be heterosexual. I think that was kind of a CYA move that they were making. They were covering their posteriors on that. But it's like, because I know that Benjamin knew people who were both trans and gay, like Lou Sullivan, and that he was a person who, personally was very comfortable with, living or being exposed to a sexual demi-monde, if you want to think of it that way. He was not a prudish person.
And I think I just wanted to add, Renee Richard also said that was one of the really important things that he did for her, that he recognized that she wasn't fitting that model of someone who would be heterosexual. And at one point he just said, that's the way it is. And he was, I think, open to, as he changed over the years, he was open to a broader view of what needed to be the criteria. If we might have Dr. Eilenfeld say a few words, Ken.
Yeah, I see him right there if he wants to say a few words. think you're unmuted now. We're not hearing you.
Okay.
Now we can.
Now
Yeah.
is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Couple of things. I think I worked with Henry in his office from 1969 to 1975. So that was, and actually by the time I left, Harry was really not working actively in New York City. But the one of the things that comes up was the question about if you're going to present yourself socially as a woman, then you have to be interested in men and the other way around. And I think some of the thought goes back to,
Step back a little from the mic, I think.
better,
Yeah, it's a little.
Homosexuality was the hottest thing in town, even back in the 70s. And I think that sort of the assumption was that if you were going to be one sex, you had to behave in a sexually appropriate way. I think one of the big things about Harry was that he took people at their word. When you were talking to him, he wasn't trying to understand why you aren't what he thinks you should be or what society thinks you should be. He was really willing to listen and see what he could do to help someone be comfortable as themselves in whatever that entails. And so we realized, of course, that there's a difference between sex and gender, for example, and that you can speak of a person's gender and as a sense of fitting in and identifying as male or female, but then your choice of sexual partner can be seen in a different way, which may or may not correlate with society's general attitudes. So it was there, and as time went on, it was really important to make that distinction and to allow whatever expression a person was seeking as being valid for that person. And really, as we've seen here, we wanted people to be themselves and had a faith that, given some liberty and some encouragement, most people would be willing to do that, even though the personal cost might be enormous. The ruptures of families, loss of jobs, and so forth and so on. One of the things that impressed me so much was how people would be willing to sacrifice all of these things, which most of us would prize so greatly, to be able to be free and live according to their own life. And I mean, to me, that was an enormous gift and something that I learned from Harry.
Thank you. There's another question about, can you share about how WPATH evolved out of his foundation? And I think, to clarify, it wasn't necessarily Alison, it wasn't his foundation. It was named after him and they changed the name. So maybe you could speak on that note.
Yeah, he did have research groups, but the WPATH, or the big didn't emerge out of his foundation specifically, but was an organization drawn together of professionals who were working in the field. And of course, many of them were connected with him, but I don't believe it was explicitly created out of something that he had created himself.
How is the transsexual? I'm sorry, Susan, were you going to say something? Or
I was just going to say that, as I understand it, the Harry Benjamin Foundation had been funded by Reed Erickson, and as that money was running out, he's going like, "How am I going to do this work?" That a bunch of his peers got together and said, "Oh, we're going to form a professional organization, and we'll name it in your honor." And I think that was in 1979 or 1980. But perhaps those of you with more direct information on it than I could clarify that.
On that note, the Reed Erickson and Benjamin, correct me if I'm wrong, Alison, had a sort of a rupture and funding stopped. And it was interesting when I was tracking his movements, his office got smaller and he moved more frequently. There's another question about, was Benjamin involved in any trans political or social activism? And I'm curious that to sort of bridge that as well, answer that question. But he was doing work from 1940 through the 1950s about this. Was he under any FBI or any government surveillance during McCarthyism? So maybe answer the first question and back into the second line.
Do not know. I think that's a great question, and I do not know if that's the case or not.
Mm-hmm. But he was not involved in any trans, activism publicly in the way that we were defining activism today, perhaps.
We would talk about it, but I think, he was certainly connected with many different networks of people, and he was supporting them in various ways, but I wouldn't describe him as an activist in those terms that we would.
I'm curious why, he was this outlier. He was sort of, maybe I'm using the wrong word, shunned, but he wasn't embraced by sort of professional colleagues. Was his work then reported on, and why didn't more people? One would think that this was an area of other physicians getting involved in. I mean, we have Dr. Ellenfeld here, but how big was the field blossoming during that period?
I think the key was really the funding from the Erickson Foundation, because before then, he was mainly publishing in sort of small journals that were not very well known, and he never had a university connection except for a very brief time in the 1930s, and so he was not very well known or regarded by academics until the funding from the Erickson Foundation came in, and he was able to produce research that was of a higher quality, and they were able to produce seminars and publications that were better regarded.
Mm. Are there any other questions that people want to raise, or questions, suggestions? I mean, it's interesting, what is the legacy of the 1966 publication, the Transsexual, Revolution, and how do you think he would have evolved, or would he not, looking at today's issues with transgender sort of pushback that is so prevalent and so horrific? How is the book perceived today?
I think it's still considered one of the sort of foundational books in the field, but we've obviously moved very far beyond that now. And the question of how he would view it today, I think it's an interesting question. I think, he would actually be quite happy to see these developments, and he's quite open to listening and to changing as he went along. So I think he would be really interested and feel in some sense vindicated by the developments we've seen so far. Dr. Eilenfeld, I wonder if you might have some thoughts about, having known him.
Muted.
You're muted, Dr. Ellenfeld.
I'm unmuted now. Okay. During the period that I was in his practice, what I recall was that he knew that his position and his practices were not at the forefront of academic or clinical medicine, but he had a great deal of faith in what he was doing and the good that it was doing, and he welcomed opportunities to try to influence, not politically but medically. He tried to speak to physicians groups, hospital groups, other groups. He wanted the word to get out, but he realized that he was fighting an uphill battle. He particularly had a thing about psychiatrists because psychiatrists knew all of the answers, except, of course, they didn't. But they knew that he was wrong, and he knew that he wasn't. So he wanted to reach out and have other physicians become involved. One of the reasons for the forming of the Gender Dysphoria Association was, as time went on, it became evident that there were a certain group of people, surgeons in particular, who were working with their own criteria, with their own reasons to give approval. We realized that there was a need to get some kind of joint understanding of fundamental course of treatment, diagnostic interviews, and best practices. And so the hope was that getting an organization together would help establish a consensus that would again make acceptance by others in the medical profession more likely. So that was a big reason to have these professional organizations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's been very moving and informative, and just to have you speak to that, and to have Susan here and Alison. Are there any other questions? I'm just going to check in the chat right now. I'm trying to read, but pay attention to the audience here. So there's a question. This is straying away from the book, so don't. Okay. Well, this we sort of answered a little bit. There's a question about Sandy Stone has critiqued 20th century trans clinics for becoming finishing schools that force trans feminine people into strict feminine gender roles in order to care. Was Benjamin more open-minded about gender roles? Did he resist the medical tendency to pathologize trans people? And I'm going to just quickly answer the last question if we don't get to it. Where is Dr. Benjamin buried? He's buried in Sag Harbor. I should say in Shelter Island, through the auspices of Dr. Ellenfeld. And that was the first question I asked Alison, because I found him on Find a Grave. Why is Harry Benjamin Shelter Island? And that's because of Dr. Ellenfeld living out there and was the sort of executor of the estate, if I'm not wrong. But maybe if Alison, you can answer the question about gender roles.
Yeah, I think that certainly is one of the criticisms of the kind of the eligibility criteria that emerged from Benjamin's work. And I think my feeling is that on a personal level, he actually knew that gender roles could be much more varied, but they were quite concerned about getting proper criteria so that people who actually chose to have a surgical transition would not regret or end up being angry at them because they regretted the transition. So they were very preoccupied with trying to make sure that people fit the gender norms of the time. And that I think reflected partly his own views about what, you know, a woman should be like and what a man should be like, but then also just very practical fears about what a person might experience after they transition. Would they be able to get a job? Would they be happy in their new life? Would they be able to have the life they wanted? And so that was part of the reason that he was very preoccupied with those norms, I think. And one of the questions was about where exactly Dr. Benjamin is buried on Shelter Island. Dr. Eilenfeld, can you answer that?
It's called the Shelter Island Cemetery, I believe.
Shelter Island, yeah. Sometime long before I came around, Gretchen, his wife, had visited Shelter Island, actually with the little monkey who was a pet of hers. But she spent some happy days on Shelter Island, and felt very strongly it was a nice place. And Bill and I moved out here, and Harry died first, and then Gretchen died a few years later, and it just seemed like a good place for them to be. So they're buried in the Shelter Island Cemetery behind the Presbyterian Church on Route 114.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
There's I'm going to shift gears a slight bit to an important question, and this is about sort of his influence in the publication and the sort of codification of rules and diagnostic tools. Is it fair to say that his strict criteria influence the way health insurance companies also create a strict criteria for access to HRT and gender affirming surgeries?
Okay. I'm sorry.
Dr. Eilenfeld, did you want to?
No, in terms of coverage, it's very important. Back in the earlier days, it was like they're pulling hen's teeth to try to get coverage for anything. You would try to submit it in a billable way, but you know, oftentimes it didn't work. So it was a problem. But the other issue in terms of including gender in one way or another in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, is insurance companies will really pay only for conditions that have a medical diagnosis. So there is some listing in the DSM which helps people who are having medically necessary treatment to get some coverage. So insurance was a consideration more so back then than it is now. But absolutely, yeah.
Well, in keeping with time, it's 7:44. Unless anyone wants to add anything, or Susan or Alison, I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you for the people who attended. Thank you for your interest in this topic. It's really important. And as a project, it's really important to us to sort of uncover this history and to have access to Susan to talk about the context, to have Alison talk about the history, Dr. Eilenfeld to talk about this deep connection, and people asking these questions that really raise important topics, issues that, you know, we are just like bridging into here is really great. So I hope this gives an introduction to other people. If you have any questions or want to follow up with me, you know where you can find us, and we can make interconnections for people who were participating. So thanks again. This is recorded, and if you haven't read the book, you can go buy the book. It's a great read about New York City history as well as this medical history. So thank you, everybody. Take care.